Welcome back to the plenary session, everyone. So today we have a Fireside panel, and just to give you a little bit of context on this, right? This is the Conference on Digital Experimentation. A lot of what we do can be really laser focused on that, right? If you're attending a lot of the parallel talks, it's laser focused on that. Each time at Code, we try to have a panel where we step back and consider some broader considerations that are relevant to experimentation, but also to some of the broader business or societal environment. And so that's what we're going to do today. So I'm Dean Eckles. I'm one of the organizers of Code, and I'm going to moderate a panel really focused on the changing data environment. And we have experts who are going to bring some different knowledge to bear on what is changing about the data environment and how we can learn about that. This is also the one part of Code that's actually just directly publicly available. So this is streaming and also is going to be publicly available immediately after the conference. So I want to start off by introducing our panelists. So down on the end here, we have Seth Neel, who's faculty at Harvard in the business school, but also affiliated with computer science. And he has a lot of expertise related to things like machine unlearning and differential privacy. But he's also been an entrepreneur. Then we have Malika Korganbekova, who's faculty at Kellogg at Northwestern University, and has, sorry, I got that wrong. You're at the other university in Chicago, the University of Chicago, the Booth School of Business, and has a lot of expertise in some of the topics that we're going to get into, specifically about data in marketing and e-commerce settings. And then right next to me, we have Eric Seufert, who's among other things, the writer and owner of Mobile Dev Memo, which is something that I subscribe to try to keep up on what's going on in the industry. And he's also the general partner at Heracles Capital. So let's welcome our panelists. So when we say the changing data environment, there's a lot of things changing at once, but I want to focus on one aspect of that, which is that there's some recent ongoing changes in the ability of firms to basically re-identify people using their services, to use a different word that maybe has a different connotation, to track people, right? And so to tell that it's you coming back to that service again. And so first, I think it's good to just spell out what are some of the changes that are happening here, and second, how much do these changes matter? And so Malika, maybe you can lay some of that out for us.
Sure, happy to. So at some point, regulators were very concerned about the user privacy, how consumer data is being collected, how it is being used. And so there are two types of changes going on. So first is regulatory changes, and there are also tech company-driven changes. So on the regulation side, different countries have different privacy regulations. So for example, in Europe, there is general data protection regulation that basically prohibits firms from using data on European consumers unless they explicitly opted in to be tracked. In the US, there is no federal level regulation, but at the same time in the US, there are state level privacy regulations. So California, Colorado, for example, have privacy regulations. And there are also industry specific regulations. So for example, health insurance markets and credit mortgage markets are regulated. And so this is on the regulation side. On the tech company side, basically potentially anticipating the regulation, companies such as Apple and Google started imposing their own privacy policies where they kind of prohibit firms sometimes to track consumers across websites. So for those of you who might be familiar with privacy, it's basically blocking third-party cookies. So Safari and Firefox have been doing it since 2019. Chrome was supposed to do that, but in July of 2024, they decided not to block third-party cookies, and they're trying to impose some other browser-level policies where you as a consumer might decide to opt out from being tracked. And I think these are the overall high-level changes that are happening. To the second part of your question about the impact that this has, it has an intended impact where the regulation was aimed to protect user anonymity, and this is something it is achieving, right? So if you don't want to be tracked, you will not be tracked. But at the same time, what is also happening is that firms now have limited ability to personalize, to run marketing strategies, to run different like digital advertising targeting. And there are unintended consequences of this where smaller firms and maybe some vulnerable groups of consumers who do not have sufficient amount of data, they start living in like algorithmic exclusion. And there are some unintended consequences where academic research has shown that privacy regulation negatively impacts smaller firms and some lower income groups of consumers.
Yeah, is there anything you'd like to add to that, Eric? You have a bit of a different kind of view on this, because I think, Malika, you looked at this partially through studies with e-commerce companies, but you kind of have a different, maybe more synoptic view of what's going on.
Well, no, I mean, I think my perspective on it would be, consistent with Malika's, but I would say that the consequences are unintended probably on the regulatory side, right? If you think about GDPR, I don't know that anybody foresaw, how sort of damaging that would be to small businesses. There's a member of European Parliament that put together a really great blog post about this a couple weeks ago. I can't remember the name of it, the blog post, but just kind of detailing like how disastrous GDPR has been for small businesses and just how much of a burden the compliance is. But I think so that may have been unforeseen, but that was kind of an unforced error because you could have just asked anybody about what the consequences would be and have gotten a pretty good indication. From the platform policy side, they're not unforeseen. I think they're very much intentional. The consequences from, for instance, like ITP, ATT, the forthcoming cookie deprecation with Chrome, those are intentional, and they're being they're being actually fought in some cases by regulators. Like the CMA is trying to prevent Google actively from deprecating third-party cookies. So I think if you kind of take that lens, it's like the platforms understand what the effects will be and the impacts will be, and it'll be very good for them, right? Because they're very large companies. The regulators probably don't understand it as deeply, and maybe fall into this trap of not recognizing a trade-off.
And I guess when you say that some of these consequences are intended, I mean, we might think of just, for example, that Apple, in rolling out app tracking transparency, very much anticipated that this would have major impacts on the business models of a bunch of advertising-supported companies, whether we're talking about Meta or smaller ones, right? That was something that clearly was anticipated, and in some ways, I think some people would argue that a bunch of those ad dollars moved into Apple's own advertising ecosystem as a result.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's demonstrable that happened, right? But I think so that's one piece, and there's a lot to talk about with that specific example. But like with cookie deprecation, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious. I mean, who benefits the most from that? It's Google, right? And then and that's in the current paradigm. If you start thinking about AI overviews and their ability to pull like the entirety of the content of the web into a content experience in Google.com and run ads against that, why would they want cookies to exist? Why would they want the long tail of the open web to be able to monetize? That doesn't benefit them in any way. That's just kind of like, it's like charity in a sense, right? So they would rather have all of that engagement concentration on Google.com. And what better way to effectuate that than to deprecate cookies?
Right, so I think it's kind of this really interesting case where there are these potential, as you mentioned, Malika, real privacy benefits for consumers of some of these changes. How much consumers really care about those particular benefits, sometimes unclear. But those are, for some consumers, real benefits. But there's actually even this tension with issues about competition and market power as well. And I think even specifically, you've done some research, Malika, in the context of e-commerce, and maybe you can say a little bit about what you found there and how you studied that.
Sure. So I partnered with Wayfair. It's a large online retailer of furniture and home goods based in Boston. So with Wayfair, the goal was to understand the impact of their personalization algorithms and how will privacy restrictions impact the ability to run these personalization algorithms, and what will be the downstream economic consequences on consumers, firm, and the sellers of the platform. And so what we did is basically we took more than 9 million consumers and ran an experiment for more than 2 years. And during the experiment, in the treatment group, consumers were in the personalized condition versus in the control group, consumers would see non-personalized bestseller recommendations. And what we find, so something like, just to give a context here, regulators usually start from the premise that personalization is harmful, and this is actually not exactly true, because at least with the Wayfair experiment, what we observed is that personalization was beneficial for consumer search. They were searching less, they could decide what to buy faster, they got better matched products. So we do find that consumers actually buy slightly more expensive items, but they actually return the purchased product less frequently compared to consumers in non-personalized condition. And on the supply side, what we see is that personalization is actually benefiting smaller sellers, less experienced sellers. And something I think that's missing from the regulatory discussion a bit is the marginal value of data for smaller firms. So because they don't have that much scale in terms of the data, what they even like small increase in the data that they get is very beneficial for them. And personalization algorithms, they tend not to discriminate between the large and small firms, as long as you're offering, like at least on e-commerce, as long as you're offering a good enough product, you will be shown higher up on the ranking page results, which will lead to better outcomes for smaller sellers. And I think, and then in the paper, we also see that the model-based predictions are saying that privacy regulations will negatively impact exactly smaller sellers and consumers who are more price responsive. And I also want to add, this is a joint work with Cole Zuber, who used to be my manager at Wayfair.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of highlights some of these unintended consequences, but also you really touched on this notion of what is the value of data for different players, right? And so, clearly, data is valuable for firms, and maybe when the firms use it in these particular ways, it could be valuable for consumers. How should we think about the economic value of data? I know this is something you've been thinking a little bit about, Seth.
Yeah, I guess maybe to zoom out a little bit from the personalization example and just think more broadly, for example, about any generic machine learning system or these generative models that we're all thinking about a lot these days. The question of how to value data is really at the forefront, right? You're seeing a lot of these very high-profile licensing deals like OpenAI, licensing Reddit data or Financial Times data, Google, and all the big players conducting these licensing data deals where it's clear they're willing to pay, we don't know exactly how much, but let's assume a tremendous amount of money for this data, even on top of the troves of data they already have, right? I think, we are still lacking a good science to think about exactly what the marginal value of data is when you're building a model. But one of the key principles, I think, is that the value of data is very context dependent. So as Malika was saying, yes, it depends how much data you already have, right? Like how large the firm is in this context. But it also depends a lot on the intended use of the model that you're building. So in like a classical machine learning context, right, where you're building a specific model for a specific purpose, for example, like personalization, maybe it's a little more clear that you can think about how much more accurate does my model get if I'm able to incorporate this data. And there are nuances with that, and you need to think about the impact on marginal subgroups of the data, think about things like privacy and fairness, but at the end of the day, it's a little more simple. Now we're moving toward this paradigm in AI where we're training these general models that are useful for a broad array of tasks, many of which we don't even know. Like the way that Dean might use ChatGPT for his research or to look up a cooking recipe might be completely different for me. And so it's very hard to assess, ex ante, what the value of incorporating data into a model that can be used for such diverse use cases really is. But this is a very exciting kind of avenue of research. And I think maybe the one concrete thing I'll say is that it starts with evaluation. So first, you need to be able to evaluate, what are these models going to be used for? And for a specific user or use case, the value of data might be different. Then you can try and start to think counterfactually, like if you included this model in training, what would the impact to the accuracy or whatever metric be? And there is an emerging science I can talk more about how to actually estimate that without having to acquire and train on the data. But
yeah, and I mean, I think one aspect of that is just, it's actually a very different type of data that we're talking about to a large degree, right? Yeah. So much of the data used for personalization is comparatively really structured data, right? Like one of the key inputs to a lot of personalization would be, hey, what products are you clicking on? What products are you buying? What products are other people buying? It's very comparatively structured data compared with, hey, we've scraped Reddit, And that may involve people describing which products they bought and how much they liked them, but it involves a whole lot of other things. So even characterizing what one data point is a little bit more challenging.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you could say a little bit more about sort of some of the developments in quantifying the value of data along the lines of what you were saying.
Yeah, I'll touch on that, but also it reminds me of what Eric was touching on earlier with the Google overviews, right? The way the data is being utilized is also like a completely new potential interface, and that also has implications, right? Because it has implications in the way that people access the data and, what platforms are actually the ground truth source of the data. But in terms of how we actually quantify the value of data scientifically, like let's just take a very simple example. Suppose that you are training a model for a specific use case. You want to ask the question, like, if I train on this new data set, for example, if I fine-tune my Llama 2 model on this Reddit corpus and I want to deploy it for customer support, how much is the accuracy going to change? This raises a bit of a problem, right? Because if you want to decide how much to pay for that data, and the only way to do it is to actually train on the data, that's going to be a hard sell for the person that you're buying the data from, potentially. And as we touched on, the downstream use cases might not even be that clear cut. But there's been some exciting work from MIT, actually, from Alexander Madri's lab and others on trying to actually predict that value of data in advance. So without getting too in the weeds here, basically running experiments of fine-tuning on different types of data and then training another model that can actually estimate the value of the data in advance. So that's sort of where the field is going, but it's very early days.
Right, and given, interpreting, say, the OpenAI Reddit deal, it's natural to sort of note that, of course, Alexander Madri spent his sabbatical at OpenAI. So clearly, this is a problem, a very practical problem that they've been facing, and I imagine they're trying to use the best tools available. I wonder if folks have any sort of further thoughts on really this development of these content licensing deals that we're seeing, which are also for very different types of content. You have for Reddit versus for newspapers, and what that is telling us about the value of these different data sources, which some of which are then not even user-generated content in some sense; they're expert-generated content.
I just kind of two quick thoughts. I think one is that I think the value changes based on the scarcity, right, or the exclusivity, right? So OpenAI has a deal with Reddit, but so does Google. So it's not exclusive data. Is that less valuable to them? Like, what if they did get it? How much of a premium would they be willing to pay if it was totally exclusive to them, right? Because ultimately, the data can be commodified, or it could be the singular competitive advantage when the actual capacity to build these models is commodified, right? And then the other piece is like, well, how much did it cost to produce the data? So that could change the valuation calculus, right? So like with Reddit, it's free. It's all UGC. But with the New York Times, it's very expensive to produce a single, new, a marginally new piece of content. Whereas for Reddit, it's totally free, right? So is that data worth less to them in that sense, right? Because it's free to them, and so they don't need to recoup any costs.
Yeah, and I think on this idea of kind of substitutability, can I go to Google and get the same answers I could get from OpenAI? There's also, can Google contract with the Wall Street Journal instead of the Financial Times, right? Or a different user-generated content source that's going to be really substitutable. And so I guess my thought would be that a bunch of the dynamics of these deals and the valuation of data has to do with this kind of substitutability, which could be hard to figure out maybe through these tiny experiments with adding just a little bit of data.
Yeah, they're almost orthogonal, right? One is saying what is the value in isolation of including this data, and the other is considering the broader data landscape and what other kinds of data are out there.
I just think it's kind of actually interesting the degree to which a bunch of the data that seems so valuable for this is so comparatively impersonal compared with a lot of what we think of as having been the really most valuable data in this kind of personalization and marketing world. And is that just that these are sort of totally different settings, or are we going to see kind of more overlap between these where, in fact, having a bunch of data that's really specifically about me and people like me is going to be very useful for improving or fine-tuning or adapting some foundation model that has just data about everyone and all kinds of news articles, et cetera, in it? Is that, Or are these going to sort of be running in parallel, or?
In terms of like data valuation in general, I used to work in investment banking many years ago, and like one of the ways to like at a high level there are two ways to value the asset. It could be revenue-based valuation or cost-based valuation, right? So from the company's perspective, the question is like, so we get new data. First of all, the question, like to Seth's point, like what is the type of the new data that we're getting, and in general, like what is the incremental value for the training accuracy, for the generated like number of consumers, for the incremental revenues that we get from the data, and then we could just like calculate the discounted cash flow from the future revenue sources, and that would be our value for data. Or it could be cost-based valuation in terms of like how costly it was to acquire the data or like to maintain the data sources. I think like both approaches could be correct. At the same time, like to your question about the more individual level, maybe proprietary data versus general data. So LLMs usually train on public, like large text corpora versus individual level data, as you also did mention. It is a very structured data set. And so my anticipation is that there is probably a way to convert the clickstream data, the structured data, into the text unstructured part, and then feed it into LLM, and maybe LLM at some point in the time will completely replace the personalization algorithms, and they will tell us what is the next product to recommend to the consumer, for example. But right now, I feel like these are two separate entities where individual companies use their own proprietary individual level data to which LLMs should not have access.
You feel like, I mean, the premise there that eventually LLMs will be making that prediction, that's kind of assuming that there's some world knowledge or reasoning that will be helpful in making these predictions. Do you think that's really necessary? I don't know a lot about this use case, but.
So I think it could be useful if LLMs kind of combine the data from different data sources, right? Which is very hard to do. And then basically unless companies voluntarily give out the data, it is very challenging, right? Yeah. But it could be very useful, right? So for example, like Wayfair is training they're training the personalization algorithms and all the algorithms on their own data versus had they had like Amazon data, or maybe they would have better understanding of what consumers are searching for, and they would have a better prediction of what the consumers might like next.
In a few minutes, I think we'll take some questions from all of you, but I want to follow up on one connection here, which is that a lot of these privacy regulations, for example, GDPR, could allow individuals to request that their data be deleted. And we talked about some of the cost of the data, but one of the things that's also very expensive about these LLMs and other, just really giant foundation models is that they're super expensive to train. And so if somebody has just spent a lot of money and energy training something, then I say, oh, could you remove my data? Can we do that? Is that technically possible? And I think this is something you've thought a bit about.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this for the last couple of years. I mean, this is what's called machine unlearning as opposed to machine learning. You want to try and kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube after you've already trained the model. As you can imagine, this is an incredibly difficult problem. Like we were just talking about the value of data and how difficult it is to quantify the impact of data on a trained model. Now we're talking about the reverse problem, right? If you want to remove the impact of data from a model, that kind of implies you should know something about the value of that data to the model. And so this problem's far from solved. What we do know how to do is for simple models, so for smaller models or maybe kind of pre-deep learning models, we do have algorithms for doing this. And the reason is because in those simpler models, we actually understand quite well how the model is using the data and what that optimization of fitting the model actually looks like. And so you can quickly kind of modify that model without having to retrain it from scratch, like throw out the data and retrain from scratch, which as Dean was saying, in the current like LLM regime would be a complete disaster.
Right, and I think probably a lot of people would be familiar with things like using a leverage or something like that in a linear regression, which we might use in the jackknife or various other methods for quantifying uncertainty. In some linear model, this is all sort of very straightforward, right?
Exactly.
But we're very far from Oh, less.
Yeah, we are. Although there are interesting approaches. There's probably two broad classes of ways people try and unlearn. One is by actually changing the way you develop the model in the first place. So, one technique is rather than building a really large model, build a bunch of tiny, smaller models that are each trained on different parts of the data. So when you delete data, it's only actually been used to train one of the smaller models, but you get the benefits of utilizing all the data. That can be effective in some cases, but training that way is just not the optimal way you train for accuracy. And so my personal view is that if we want to build systems where it's easy to remove data and we can really comply with these kind of deletion requests, we need to tackle the hard problem, which is train the model in the state-of-the-art way, the way it's going to be deployed in practice by companies, and develop techniques that can modify those models. So that's what we're working on, but it's very far from settled.
I also want to say, when we retrain the model, I think something that people might, my research is about social responsibility of firms, and I think it's important to understand that when you retrain this type of large models, you are also emitting more carbon emissions. All this inefficiency in training, it leads to more carbon emissions and environmental impact that firms have on the society.
Yeah, so I guess unlearning is really a question about computation. We don't want to spend all these GPU cycles, all these carbon emissions, everything is all the time to retrain the model. We want to have a sort of a shortcut, basically, to remove the impact of a small amount of data and not undo all the work we've done in training.
Yeah, I think it's also a function of evaluating the inputs as personal data or not in the first place, right? So the EDPB is going to issue an opinion about this soon, but the idea is what should count as personal information? Because this gets transformed in a way where it may not be relatable to any individual as an output, right? But if nonetheless I say, well, that's my personal data. And the way that we kind of conceptualize personal data in the GDPR context is here's some data that is an artifact of my usage of your product, which the GDPR says belongs to me, right? Okay, so then give me that back or delete it. I have the right to be forgotten. I have the right to get an accounting of my artifacts, and I have the right to just see, to basically own that. And the question is okay, if this is the open web corpus or whatever, this wasn't generated by you for this purpose. This is freely available to anyone. So is that personal data, right? Is that something that you have any sort of credible, sort of claim on, versus anybody else doing just standard web scraping, right? And so I think that's a kind of you've got to make that distinction, and you've got to be really prescriptive about what constitutes personal data before I think you can start making the rules about basically throwing out models that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train, right? It just feels very unproductive to start with the restrictions and then follow those with the definitions.
Yeah, and the jury is still out on that currently legally, from what I understand. It's not like we're having a lot of mandated model destruction because of data deletion. There's been some commentary from the UK data authorities that this might be necessary potentially. But one disconnect there is you might be thinking well, why does this large model even encode someone's personal data in a way that could actually lead to a privacy violation? If you just delete their data from the database, aren't you fine? The model is such a large and black box kind of thing. Why would we even think we need to retrain that? And so there's been a lot of work showing that you can reverse engineer personal data from the weights of a model. And the larger the model, the higher the risk of personal data being reverse engineered, because large models memorize data more. They have a larger capacity for memorization. But there's still a disconnect between sort of the reality of that and the regulatory sides.
And just to get at some of these examples that we might have in mind, there can be a little bit of vagueness, right? So if what's in the training data is me having written a post somewhere, a review, a post on Reddit, saying that I bought some product and I liked it or I didn't like it, right? Stripped of my username, et cetera, we might not think that that's personally my personal information at all. Certainly it's not PII. But then, I might go on to say more there, or depending on how this has all been hoovered up in an unstructured format, it might say Dean Eckles right next to it in the corpus. And so in this context of such unstructured data, it seems very challenging to know in advance whether there's going to be personal data or even something that is very clearly PII embedded there.
Well, it's synthetically PII, right? So if you wrote a Reddit post about how you were moderating a panel at Code wearing a brown blazer and, well, okay, you string enough of those clues together that's synthetic information about, or synthetically like an identifier in that way. But the question is like, well, that's public. You read it. So I guess the question is like, is that your data? Do you own that data, which anybody could have accessed freely? Is that somehow like is that property that you have a claim on, right?
Well, and I guess part of it could relate to exactly how sort of prominent it was prior and how prominent it might be made by some new use of it. Okay, I want to make sure that we get to involve all of you in the conversation. So I think we have a couple folks with microphones, and I'm happy to take a question for the panel. Okay, we've got one over here.
So if we're thinking about personalization, whether for ads or even with these LLMs, so I think maybe a couple years ago, we were talking a lot about having access to my data, portability of data, taking it somewhere else. So now with this ability of LLMs to just like parse data, what do you think about me having my data, maybe providing it to LLM as part of context prompt, RAG, or whatever, and then kind of getting more of these personalized recommendations, or even me providing them to an advertiser that they can use my profile for asset generation and having better ads. But it seems the conversation hasn't been so far recently about like the user having access to their own data and kind of shopping it around and possibly getting better performance from LLMs or better performance from ads. So how do you see, is there any link there that's happening? How do you see that progressing?
I think this is a very good point, because this is exactly what I was referring to when I said that there could be a way to make the structured clickstream data unstructured. If I chat with the GPT and I just start saying, so here is the products that I looked at, and this is what I like. What do you recommend? Then it will basically replace the personalization algorithm. In terms of the data policies here, I think it again sticks to the question of the data value. Like as a consumer, how much do you value your data to feed it into this type of models? And it again becomes a big question of data valuation for the companies. And from the perspective of retailers and all the companies that are selling the products, it's also a big loss, right? Like I'm an economist by training. I'm always thinking about the market equilibrium. So if consumers start chatting with GPT and trying to understand their preferences and get recommendations, that means that the companies are getting less traffic on their website, they're getting less advertising revenue. There is all this market equilibrium things that are happening, which might make data more valuable. And now again, it all becomes very unclear. It is a super interesting future area.
But I guess the flip side of that is, if you're having these interactive conversations with the user, maybe you get better discovery of user preferences, and then you get more effective.
That is very right in terms of if the platforms embed AI into their shopping experience, that would be really cool. And actually, there are some attempts to do that, as far as I know.
And I want to make sure we touch on the aspect of kind of personal data portability and what that would mean for competition. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Eric.
No, not any, nothing worth sharing.
Well, I mean, I guess just to kind of push on that a little bit more, I mean, in a lot of cases, there's not a way to do this as a user because that may not be to the benefit of those data providers, and also because when in the past they have made that possible, there have been things that now retrospectively we think of as sort of privacy breaches or scandals, right? I mean, you think about a bunch of Cambridge Analytica was about data portability, right?
Sort of. So okay. So if you think of DMA, I mean, one of the principal, sort of accomplishments there, you call it, is that it allows people to sort of take things with them, right? It's my data. I could take it over to this company, but a lot of the infrastructure between these companies is not really interoperable in that way, and part of the issue with just allowing the data to be moved from one place to the other is privacy, right? So there's a convenience there, but there's also a reason to not want to build that natively. And I think it's actually one of the principal problems with the DMA is just like a lack of recognition of like, well, what was the reason for doing that in the first place? It's not all just like sort of building a competitive mode. It's actually like, well, there's a good reason to not want to make someone's data available to every service, even if they didn't like interact with that service to produce that data. And I think it gets even hairier when you start talking about like LLMs or something. Like, so it's interesting is like if I have my history with OpenAI and like I've sort of had this conversation and sort of like navigated to the perfect point. Well, can I take that history with me to some other company? Well, I think OpenAI could credibly say, well, no, we earned that. Like we acquired that user. We sort of facilitated that back and forth to sort of like tune this conversation to produce outputs that the user found to be sufficient. And so like why should I have no duty to deal here? I have no duty to sort of like make that and like to sort of bestow that asset onto the user that they can then go and take and sort of unlock the utility elsewhere.
Right, and I guess part of the argument there being we'd like firms to invest in the technologies that would allow the kind of collection and personalization process and not just sort of necessarily free ride on others having done that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another question from the audience. Oh, yeah, right here.
I had a question around this idea of the right to be forgotten, which I guess is a legal definition, right? And it can be mapped differently onto the idea of, say, machine learning. Mm-hmm. Like you can imagine a whole span of like guarantees you could provide in the strongest sense, a model trained without your data, but in a rather weak probabilistic guarantee sort of a sense that it doesn't really influence the outcomes of the model in some way. So have you thought about like that space of sort of mapping that legal definition onto this framework and like presumably the stronger the guarantee, the bigger the costs to the company or things like that, right? So is there a way to sort of trade those two things off against each other?
Yeah, I think it's a little technical to dive into here, but maybe what I will say is that there are a lot of potential use cases for unlearning, and one of the motivating use cases is this right to be forgotten, where that's really about privacy, right? And so maybe you don't need such a strong guarantee, like the model is exactly the model you would get if you retrained without it. Maybe you want a guarantee like if someone's interacting with the model, they can't infer anything about your data, right? And one implies the other. That's actually a weaker guarantee than really retraining the model. And so you might be able to do things more efficiently or quicker or more accurately under that weaker guarantee. And so that is something that people have pursued. But if you're using unlearning for like trying to train out bad behavior from an LLM, that's a completely different sort of definition that you might want, right?
And just to kind of to pick up on this this probabilistic notion or some idea there, right? Like that has close connections with differential privacy,
right,
which is one of the kind of major privacy preserving technologies that's being adopted, and that would sort of have guarantees about being able to infer whether somebody's data is present or whether their data takes a particular value. And I think from a legal perspective, one of the things that seems very challenging to me there is that differential privacy and many other privacy-preserving concepts are continuous concepts, right?
Yes.
There's some parameter that we're going to choose in differential privacy. It's often epsilon or epsilon and delta that are telling us about how much we can say about whether your data is in there or how much we can say about your characteristics. But that's just a continuous number, and the law doesn't often, it's written in language and written in qualitative terms, makes it very hard to say something about that number specifically. And so I don't know if you've thought a bit, or any of you have thought a bit about how we can map regulations that are written one way to things that are often these very quantitative concepts.
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the sort of long-standing problems in differential privacy generally. I think if you had an answer of how to set the level of privacy, that would be a tremendous contribution. But maybe to say a little bit more, differential privacy is really about adding statistical noise to the outputs of some computation before you show them. And by adding a very small amount of noise, you can hide the impact of a small amount of that data while still getting accuracy. And so this shows up in, for example, the US Census Bureau used differential privacy in the last census to release statistics. Apple uses differential privacy to collect on-device statistics while still being able to analyze them and make predictions. And the important thing is that the level of that noise, how large it is, that's what trades off the accuracy versus the privacy. The larger the value of that, think about just like the magnitude of the noise, the standard deviation, the larger that is, the more privacy you're guaranteeing to the users, but the less accuracy. And so it's impossible to set the right value there unless you actually know what the value of privacy is. We might be able to compute the value of accuracy, but without knowing what the value of privacy is to the user, I think it's very challenging. My personal view is to take a more practical approach and think about, okay, in the given setting, with the kind of data that we have and how we're deploying, let's say, this model, here are some practical privacy attacks that an adversary could run. A malicious kind of person trying to access the underlying data. And, here's how successful those attacks are at given levels of privacy. And then I think that gives you a more reasonable basis to actually set the values.
Yeah, I mean, even just sort of eliciting that from the public or from policymakers could be difficult. I mean, I think on that point, it's been striking to me, if you look back at a lot of the differential privacy literature, people are using these values of how much noise is being added that correspond to, I don't know, it's like epsilon of 0.1 or smaller, right? Which involves a lot of privacy. You can learn very little about individual people. And then the actual implementations of differential privacy that I've seen use epsilons of like 12 or 20, right? Which actually means that there's very little in sort of this worst case guarantee.
It's a log scale, so that's like a lot worse.
It's a lot worse, yeah. And so and so that's kind of really striking. In some sense, probably there is actually a quite meaningful privacy protection occurring even with these very large values, but that's not sort of where the theory is giving us a lot of bite in a lot of ways. And so that seems it provides relatively unclear guidance.
Yeah, that's very in line with kind of my philosophy on it too, which is that because there's such a wide disparity, you sort of have to evaluate this more empirically. Rather than.
I think in Europe they actually, so there are also probabilistic algorithms, right, which would recognize consumers in a probabilistic way without knowing the exact user identity. And my understanding is that in Europe it is fairly discouraged. They discourage firms to use that because they are worried that there will be either racial profiling or, in general, the data will be leaked if the threshold is not good enough, is not low enough, so the privacy would not be protected.
And I know, Eric, you've been very much following some of what's happening in sort of probabilistic, solutions to some of these privacy changes, and the degree to which maybe some of that has just kind of been sleight of hand.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's just a code word for taking deterministic signals and packaging them together and saying, hey, I bet this is probably that person, right? It's not actual there's no probability distribution that's informing that decision. But I think to Seth's point, there's no singular value of epsilon. You could say this is it. Everyone who works in any sort of consumer-facing tech platform, here's your value of epsilon. You must, adhere to that because it's very context dependent. It also depends on the inputs, right? Some inputs, there's probably not a whole lot there's not a vector of risk, right? In some, it's very sensitive. You could think about, something like a dating website, or you would be very careful there. You have to be much more cautious.
Genomic data.
What's that?
Or your genomic data.
Yeah, genomic data is another perfect example. So I think that's a difficulty of this, but there's also sort of a political calculus, which is there's very much a reluctance to get specific, because first of all you might say, well, no, I mean there is no acceptable threshold of risk here. 0 is the threshold of risk that we accept. And so there may not be any aggregation of this data or any sort of usage of this data with machine learning algorithms. The FTC just had an investigation, or they finished a report on social media. It was a bipartisan report. It started in the previous leadership. And they said, look, machine learning is really problematic. I mean, this is years late, right? That's the issue with Europe versus the US. Europe is proactive with this, and the US is very reactive, and it's mostly driven by lawsuits, not legislation, right? But they said, okay, well, the use of machine learning is problematic in social media platforms. Well, that genie's kind of out of the lamp here. I think they're all pretty much built on these algorithms. And say, well, you could infer a lot of things from their usage. And so I guess the question is like, well, okay, is inference, is that an acceptable substitute for gathering that data? And is inference itself a negative thing by default? And are there just simple controls you can put on top of that? It's like, well, maybe you did infer that, but you can't use it for targeting, right? Because they already institute. Those are sort of like well-accepted restrictions on targeting. Like you can't target based on known income or inferred income, or marital status, or race. Like those are no reasonable person pushes back on those.
Mm-hmm. For things like housing, advertising,
right.
et cetera. Yeah. And yeah, so there's various different points that you could intervene in that process, and some of it might be mistargeted if we are thinking about, oh, you're not going to use this data at all. We're not going to use machine learning at all, as opposed to restricting downstream actual actions based on that. Okay, I want to take another question from the audience, I think. Oh, over here.
So you mentioned how in our cookie-restricted world now, first-party data is becoming a lot more valuable, and it's usually much richer. You can have various methods for creating recommendations, personalization, collaborative filtering, contextual bandits, kind of richer, newer methods. At the same time, there is a lot of development that's very significant around transferable knowledge via LLMs in terms of consumer preferences, consumer patterns that can also be applied to particular cases. How do you see these two types of data, the more general information encoded in LLM reasoning, as well as the first-party, isolated specific information, being used together to improve how companies interact with their customers?
So I think, like in general, like at the beginning stage at least, I think LLMs will be complementary to the proprietary data that the platforms have, right? So LLMs just simply do not have sufficient amount of data to train and replace a personalization algorithm, but they could serve as an additional data source where, like, if the consumers can say something to LLM about their preferences, which they cannot reveal from like clicking on products, right? Because there is only so much you can do when you click on the data. On the product, then I think in that sense it will be complementary to the current state. And in some sense, LLMs are like, not LLMs, but in general, all this AI technology is already complementary. So for example, I know that Wayfair has this AI algorithm that if you go to Wayfair store, for example, you can use image, like there is an image recognition deep learning algorithm that basically shows you like how the product will be shown in your place, like what are the sizes, etc. So you can play around with that. Like there is already that, and it is complementary shopping experience. And in terms of like the data use, I think at least at the beginning, LLMs should be complementary to the data, but I do not think that they will be substitutes in the near future. And I think I really like Eric's point about the fact that like who will earn the revenue from that in terms of like how do we do the revenue sharing if LLMs are helping the platform to sell the product, et cetera. Like it's also a contractual, there is a contractual question of like how do we share the revenue from that.
And any other responses to that? Let's take another question here.
How do you see the internet becoming more closed? And how do you see regulations leading to different and or degraded user experience?
I can take this one if you want. So I think regulation is strengthening. So in some sense, it is true that users have worse experience. At the same time, I think the motivation from the regulatory perspective is that users have very high privacy valuation, right? So it is kind of compensating. And it is not clear how much in dollar value the users value their privacy to offset the negative effects from like not having digital advertised targeting or personalization. And in academic research, my colleague at the University of Chicago, Avner Strulov-Schlein, and Tesseri Lim from Boston University, they have very interesting research on consumer privacy valuation. So there is also this stated paradox of privacy paradox, where consumers' stated preferences are very different from what they actually do online. So they might think that they value their privacy a lot, but at the same time, they might value the information security or data breaches are very important, but when it comes to personalization and marketing-related activities, maybe consumers do not value their privacy as much, right? But I think this is something I do research on right now in terms of like what is, to quantify what is the dollar value of privacy that consumers have to justify the negative effects from limited personalization.
I mean, you look at so Apple is engaged in like a sort of worldwide advertising campaign on this exact topic, right? I mean, you go and see billboards like "Privacy, that's Apple," and they obviously think there's some kind of commercial advantage to having that narrative, be applied to their products. But I would point to Safari market share. Why is it flat since ITP? 2017 is when ITP was introduced. Why didn't it budge? It's basically flat, right? And so I think you can make the case like, well, people don't really know what ITP was, and they don't perceive the impact to them. But I think, well, Apple's made it clear to people that they get better protection with Safari than with Chrome. So I think I agree with you. I think it's just like a revealed preferences thing. It's like people, well, and it's also like the way it's posed. Do you value your privacy? Of course I do. Like, I don't want you peering in my window, right? Like, if you look back in like what Brandeis wrote, like about the idea of privacy, right? Like, it's it was all about the sort of like the emergence of tabloids, right? Peering through people's windows and taking pictures of them. Like, of course everyone says, no, that's a horrible thing. Like, you shouldn't do that. I guess the question is, like, if you say, well, do you value ads personalization that uses some of your behavioral history to make ads more relevant to you? I think most people say, yeah, of course I do. Like, this is also like a framing thing.
And I think that's a big challenge in a lot of these kind of calculations of consumer and overall welfare in these settings is that it can be really hard to measure these things, especially as we saw this morning in the context of free services. We don't actually have a clear sense of how much people are valuing an advertising-supported service unless we kind of engage in these sort of choice experiments, which come with kind of their own baggage. And so it seems like there's often an implicit assumption around the value of privacy, and it is legitimately difficult to measure in a lot of cases. Let's take another question from the audience. I don't know where we are right now. Any more questions? Oh, right here.
Thank you. Malika, I wanted to ask you about the experiment, actually, regarding what you mentioned about the quantifying the value of privacy, because you mentioned that you are now conducting it, right?
So we are actually, with Sarah Moshari from UC Berkeley, we have an early stage project where we're trying to understand exactly like what is the consumer's understanding of personalization? Do they understand what personalization is, and how much they value their data in this regard? So right now it's not an experiment; it's a survey-based. But based on the survey, we want to run an experiment online where we would probably change like how the products are shown to the consumers, and maybe show them different pop-up windows in terms of like how what kind of data is being used and see their reaction to that. So this is an early stage project, but I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. Okay, if you will have some findings to share, it would be
Thank you.
Great. I wanted to kind of follow up on some implications of all of this that are really connected with code, with experimentation, right? And so at least the sort of little bit the way I think about it is that there was this sort of golden era for marketing and experimentation, right? There was this period of time when all of a sudden marketers could be running individual level experiments, exposing people or not to various kinds of interventions, whether it's advertising or other interventions, and then actually linking that to the outcomes that they cared about, like sales. And they could do this through, through Meta, through YouTube, through a number of places. And then that's sort of going away right now, and we're having to turn to other ways of evaluating the impact of interventions. And so is that kind of a good gloss of that story? And what are firms actually turning to as things have gotten more difficult? I think, Eric, you might have some perspectives.
Yeah, I think that, yes, I agree with the premise there. I mean, I will say, look, it's not good. Just from a welfare standpoint, if like companies have carte blanche to just like collect as much data as they possibly can, store it forever, and use it however they want, like that's not a good outcome. That's not good for anybody. Like, and that's it deteriorates trust. It's corrosive for trust. I think it's corrosive for even like social cohesion, right? I mean, you don't want to genuinely believe that you do exist in a surveillance state. Like that's not a comfortable.
Or that something that starts out one way could be dramatically transformed. That I'm giving my data to some firm or interacting with it for one reason, and then decades on, it could be used against me in ways that I have no control over.
Right, or you're blackmailed or something like that. That's obviously a bad outcome, right? But I do think there was a golden age for marketing, and that I think it's ended in the sense that like the deterministic end-to-end flow of data has been fully disrupted. But there are ways of applying technology and applying statistical methodologies to retain some of the signal, not all of it, but some of it, right? And I think like it's probably, I think we're entering like a new renaissance of like really interesting problems to be solved in marketing versus just like dumb guerrilla counting. It's like, okay, we've got a cookie ID, that means that's a match, that's great. Like, that's success. And I think, what's really exciting about this moment, and just to be optimistic, right, is that like there are a whole lot of smart people that are bringing new methodologies to market to enable commerce, right? Because that's what advertising enables essentially, is digital commerce, to enable commerce at this very large scale, while protecting user privacy and yet still fulfilling like sort of like economic benefits of that, right? And so that's really exciting, and maybe that'll sort of like usher in this new golden age. It's even better than the last age, because who knows what happens when you get a bunch of really smart people tackling these problems versus just a bunch of like dumb counting going on either side.
Yeah, and for that matter, that previously sometimes we were fooling ourselves about actually exactly how good things were, right? We know that sometimes, there were multiple devices associated with the same user, and so if you weren't Meta, if you weren't, Google, maybe you weren't able to really be re-identifying people so with such great confidence as sometimes people fooled themselves into thinking that. And then there are, all these technologies, from differential privacy, federated learning, and I think maybe of a lot of interest to the people here, things for dealing with experiments with a small number of units, for geo-randomized experiments and synthetic control. And so that's, in some sense, to the extent that we're advancing that methodology, we're helping to enable commerce in a more privacy-preserving environment. So that could be great.
Yeah, and like cryptographic methods for doing the matching without leaking anything out. Federated learning is really exciting. Any sort of like on-device processing is really exciting. I think all this stuff this feels like there's like a turning point, right? And like that, well then, hey, you get to unleash all of the sort of human innovation on this problem versus just doing dumb counting.
I just want to say, I have a project with Wayfair on the geo experiments, and it might seem that it is one way to doing this cluster randomized experiments might be a good way to resolve the whole privacy situation. But at the same time, the geo experiments are challenging themselves, right? Because there is a spillover leakage of consumers from one region to another. It's really hard to identify them. Again, we're dumping into this privacy question of that. As companies, for example, we might not know who the user is and where they're located. And that's why we cannot quantify the spillover effects during the experiment versus someone like Google, for example. They know exact geolocation, and then they would be able to quantify and get correct point estimate and the inference on the experimental outcomes, which companies that are running experiments by themselves, it might be very challenging to do. So again, I think there is a privacy question there too.
And just turning back to some of the kind of competition consequences of all this, I just think about, in the case of say, geo-randomized experiments, which often have much lower power than other cases, who does that end up hurting? Actually, in contrast to some of the the other patterns, it might be that it's actually not so bad for smaller firms who didn't have a large sample size, the raw sample size, before you aggregate by geography. But for the giant firms that were also chasing 0.5% lifts in revenue, they can't detect that with the geo-randomized experiment, but maybe we're fine with that. We're fine with them not optimizing a little bit more. And so I wonder if you've thought about some of the competition consequences of a switch to geo-aggregated analyses, experiments, or marketing mix modeling, whatever it may be.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Media mix modeling has taken on like a sort of newfound, prominence because of a lot of the privacy restrictions. Media mix modeling is a tool. It fits into a toolkit in a sort of very particular way. I think people rely on it too much in some instances. There's cases where that's seen as like a perfect replacement, like a perfect replacement for measurement. Infrastructure is just not. You have to use it in a different way. It interfaces with the sort of like the entirety of the organization in a different way. It's not. You can't just like rip out your old deterministic attribution system and plug media mix modeling in. It doesn't. But it's helpful. I think that one of the issues here, and there's just like an asymmetry with what the power that a lot of the big advertising platforms unlocked was allowing small businesses to reach customers effectively. Well, by definition, those small businesses don't have as many resources as the big platforms. And so there's a total dependency on the big platforms to provide these tools for them. Now, that's great if you trust the big platform. It's great if you trust the big platform to be honest and forthright and transparent. If you don't, it's problematic, right? And so, like a small company implementing a media mix model, that helps. That provides some guidance. But at the end of the day, you're going to be totally reliant on the big platform to tell you what the effect of your advertising spend was. And so I think that's kind of the place we're at now. There's a lot of companies, small businesses saying, I don't exist but for this. Like D2C goes away if there's not if there's not an ability for small businesses to reach, customers. Like D2C is like a segment of e-commerce. A lot of mobile app categories go away completely, like absent the ability to target specific behaviors, right? And so those companies don't have any choice. It's not that they would love to build this tech. They can't. It's infeasible, right? And so it's like, well, I either trust a big platform or I just pack up. Mm-hmm. What choice do I really have?
Yeah, and at least, overall, I don't think that we've seen a ton of recent competition on transparency of advertising platforms to advertisers. And in fact, in some ways, I think of going back now really far in history, right? We've had a just sort of steady creep towards more automation by the platform, right? Even you go way back to Overture versus Google in cost per click ads, right, in search results. The initial pioneer of doing pay per click search ads, it was just entirely transparent that you won the auction if you bid the most, right? Obviously, this had terrible incentives, right? Because you can show people really irrelevant ads that will, be valuable to you some of the time, or maybe are valuable to you just to show them even when people don't click. And so it was really inefficient, but for a long time, advertisers loved that transparency. And I know that was something that back in the day, people were saying, no, that's why we love advertising on Yahoo instead of Google. But clearly, there was a way less efficient system, and we've moved farther and farther in that direction of letting the platform do so much of the prediction for you. And I think that kind of fits with this idea that as maybe you need to rely on more and more complex models of attribution and measurement, it's even more trust is placed in the platform. Do we have one more question from the audience?
There's one over there.
Yep.
Hi. My question was in the context of experiments. In the past few years, there was a concern raised on the guinea pig problem, where users are subjected to experiments online without seeking consent, for example, and is that an ethical issue, for instance? I was curious if that's still an ongoing debate in the broader discourse, and if solutions like informed consent, asking people if they want to be part of experiments, have been explored, or is that like an issue that's fizzled out and no one's really worried about that anymore.
I think you're right. So suppose if you're a behavioral researcher and you're running experiments and you have to get for example, as an academic researcher, you would have to get IRB approval to run any experiments versus online platforms, they're running experiments. But at the same time, users, when they consent to data use, there is usually a fine printed comment saying that your data might be used to improve our product. And one way to improve the product is to run a field experiment and understand what is the winning outcome for the platform. So in that sense, users are agreeing to the experimentation. To the best of my knowledge, I do not think there is an ongoing discussion, big discussion on this. But it is an ethical question. And of course, platforms themselves, they want to protect themselves from the regulation, from the consequences of the regulation. And so any reputable platforms, they will not run anything doubtful on the users, I feel like.
So my sense is, when it comes to regulation in the US, one of the common modes is that there's zillions of bills proposed that are basically dead on arrival. And so certainly I know that there have been some in the Senate that would have actually severely curtailed the ability of platforms to run just simple A/B tests basically without specific per test informed consent. But I think those haven't really gone anywhere. I know that one of those had been proposed when I testified in a Senate subcommittee a couple years ago. That was a bill that one of the senators had proposed, but I think this was one of these things that everybody was like, well, that's nice that you wrote that, but we're not going to do that. I think if anything, from a regulatory perspective, there's actually people who've been urging policymakers to encourage experimentation, right? This is some of the best data that we could have, right? This is the perspective we have at this conference, right? We want to create this super high quality data about important questions. And so rather than say, trying to decide whether Instagram harms teen girls based on a leaked survey that asked teen girls whether they thought Instagram harmed them, it would be a lot better to be relying on super high quality experimental evidence. And so my sense is that there has been a little bit of a shift in that conversation that hopefully is more towards recognizing the huge value, public policy value of experimentation. I don't know if there's other thoughts on where experimentation specifically fits into some of this new data environment.
Well, so there's in Europe, I think the idea that this kind of experimentation benefits users is being contested currently, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the idea that, well, actually, no, that should fall into the consent framework because you're collecting this data and there's this, there's something happening, to this person and they haven't consented, right? And I feel like maybe there has been a vibe shift away from, well, no, that actually doesn't, that only benefits the company. The company's going to make more money, but that's not going to in any way benefit. And there's not well, okay, there's the next step after that, which they, are able to sort of invest more into the platform and bring more features to bear. So I think in Europe, I think maybe there is maybe some resistance to that, but I think, to your point, I don't think there's any traction with that argument here.
Yeah. Okay, I think there's a lot more we could discuss, but we should wrap up the panel. And so let's thank all of our panelists.